Genesis 20. If you've got your Bible, you can turn there. We'll have it up on the screen as well. Genesis 20. There was a preacher who went to the church office one Monday morning, and he found a dead mule laying out in the churchyard. And he called the police, and he said, "Can y'all come get this thing?" And they said, "Well, do you suspect foul play?" He says, "No, I don't suspect any foul play." And the police said, "Well, if there's no foul play, then you're going to have to call the health department." So he called the health department, and the health department said, "Well, a dead mule, that's really not a health threat. What you got to do is you got to call the sanitation department for them to come pick it up." So he said, okay. So he called the sanitation department. He gets the sanitation manager on the phone, and he says, "I really would like to come pick it up, but anything like that, we have to actually have authorization from the mayor before we can do it. So you're going to have to call the mayor and get authorization for us to come and pick that dead mule up." And the preacher really didn't want to call the mayor because he knew the mayor had a bad temper and he was just hard to get along with. And the preacher decided, "I'm going to call him anyway. I got to do something to get rid of this mule." So he calls and he tells the mayor about it. The mayor gets upset and he just really starts to grumble, and then he starts ranting and raving, and he finally says, "And preacher, why did you call me? Isn't it your job to bury the dead?" And the preacher said, "Yes, it is my job to bury the dead. I just thought it'd be common courtesy to call the next of kin first." So, let me take you back to November. In Sunday services, we were going through Genesis. Right? And then we kind of took a break for Christmas and New Year's, and then now we're going back into Genesis. Here's what we saw. We saw the creation. We saw how God created everything by His Word except for man, and that man He made from the dust of the ground, and then woman He made from man. We saw the fall of man, how they were given that commandment not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and they did anyway, after they were tempted by the devil to do so. We saw the flood, where God destroyed the earth and everything that was in it except for what was in Noah's ark. Then we saw Abram, and we saw a promise that God made to him that him and his descendants would have all the land that he could see, and that also that he would have a child, even a child of his old age. And after the last time that God promised Abraham that he was going to have his son through his wife Sarah, and if you remember, that was quite a miracle of a prophecy even, because usually you don't tell a 100-year-old man and a 90-year-old woman that they're going to have kids. That's usually just not the way that it works. And so God had made that promise, and then God decided to let Abraham know what was going to happen to Sodom and Gomorrah. The angels then go in and they save Lot, but Sodom and the surrounding cities are burned up in fire and brimstone. And now in Genesis, the narrative turns back from Sodom and turns towards Abraham. In this morning's passage, Abraham has another run in with a powerful king, and it's going to feel like deja vu. Are you familiar with the French word deja vu? Have you ever heard that before? Deja vu. It means seen again. It's a psychological term for that weird feeling you get when something happens and you're like, "I've already seen this. I've already seen this. I've seen it, And it's just kind of a weird thing, because sometimes you really hadn't saw it. You just kind of get the feeling that you have saw it before. Sometimes maybe you had a dream that was similar to it, and it's kind of that weird thing. Well, I think you might get that feeling this morning when we go through this passage. You might feel a little bit of deja vu. We're going to see the dream, the disclosure, and the denouement. It's going to be here in Genesis 20. Let's read this chapter together. "And from there Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negeb, and lived between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, 'She is my sister.' And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, 'Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife.' Now Abimelech had not approached her. So he said, 'Lord, will you kill an innocent people?' He did not himself say to me, 'She is my sister.' And she herself said, 'He is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands I have done this.' Then God said to him in the dream, 'Yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore I did not let you touch her. Now then, return the man's wife, for he is a prophet, so that he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not return her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours." So Abimelech rose early in the morning and called all his servants and told them all these things. And the men were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, "What have you done to us, and how have I sinned against you, that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done." And Abimelech said to Abraham, "What did you see that you did this thing?" Abraham said, "I did it because I thought, there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, 'This is the kindness you must do me. At every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother.' Then Abimelech took sheep and oxen and male servants and female servants and gave them to Abraham, and returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, 'Behold, my land is before you. Dwell where it pleases you.' To Sarah he said, 'Behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. It is the sign of your innocence in the eyes of all who are with you, and before everyone you are vindicated.' Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, and also healed his wife and female slaves, so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife." I want you to see first the dream. So Abraham and Sarah traveled down to Gerar to sojourn there for a while. And what does he tell everybody? Hey, this is my sister. This is my sister. Sarah's my sister. Now, doesn't that feel a little bit like deja vu? Do you remember that? Do you remember back in Genesis chapter 12 when they went into Egypt? What is it that they told Pharaoh? She's my sister. She's my sister. Over and over again. And we're going to actually see when we get later on with Isaac and Rebekah, he's going to tell them, this is my sister. It was something that they kept on doing, something about Abraham and his family that they like to tell people, hey, this is my sister, instead of my wife. Doesn't that feel a little bit like deja vu? But you know what it goes to show? It goes to show how our faith, even when it is strong, can still be abandoned to fear. Think about it. Abraham had just spoken to God in person. Don't you think that strengthened your faith up a little bit? If you and God had just stood on the mountain and had looked down at the cities in the valley of Sodom and Gomorrah and those other cities that were down there, and you had had a face-to-face discussion with God, don't you think your faith would be pretty strong? And he was. And what do we find out over and over? That Abraham is a man of faith and a man of faith and a man of faith. He had just watched God's mighty power destroy a whole group of cities. And God had just told him that he would have a son through the promise of Sarah. That his son, that son of the promise, would be born of him by Sarah. And what does he do? When the going got tough, he turned his back to the old way and he told the half-truth that Sarah was his sister to try to save his own skin. Was God going to let anything happen to Abraham if he had just told the truth and said, this is my wife, Sarah? No. Why not? Because God had just said, I will give you a son and he will be great. Did Abraham have a son yet? No. So was God going to let anything happen to him? No. But he did. He still let his faith be shaken in that fear. You see, there's going to come a time in your life when your faith is going to be thin. It's going to be shaken. And you are going to let fear overcome your faith. It happens to everybody. It even happened to Abraham, the father of our faith. But what's important is not that you slipped in your faith, but what you do after you slip in your faith. Abraham lived the rest of his life after this as a life of faith. What will you do? What will you do? There will come a time that fear will overcome your faith. The question is what do you do after that? Do you build your faith back up and do you live a life of faith, or do you continue to let fear rule your life? Abimelech, who was the king, took Sarah and said, well, if she ain't your wife, she'll be a good one for me. So she takes him and says, I'm going to marry him. Now, Sarah must have been good looking, or Abimelech must have been older, because she was 89 years old at the time. But he's like, I'm going to take her. Usually when you see kings that were doing that, they were going into a place and they were taking the 18, 19, 20-year-olds that had a lot of childbearing years so that the kings could have so many kids, and that's what they were doing. But that's not what he did here. But that night, before Abimelech had approached Sarah, he had a dream. That's what the scripture says, before he approached her, before he went into the bedroom with her. And he was laying there and he had a dream. And it says, God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said to him, behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. Now Abimelech, he says, what are you talking about? Hold on, I did this in my innocence and my integrity is there, because he told me it was his sister. And she said, he's my brother. So why am I in trouble now? And God said, you're right. You have had integrity. You were going off what the knowledge you knew was. And then he says, and it was me. God says, it was me who kept you from going into the bedroom with her. I did that. God keeps his promises. Let's say things have progressed and Abimelech had gone into Sarah's bedroom, and they had been there, and they had consummated this marriage that had just happened that day. And then 40 weeks later, Sarah gives birth to a child. What's everybody going to wonder? Was it Abraham's? Or was it Abimelech's? Whose was it? But God didn't let that happen. People would have always wondered if he was the child of the promise. But God kept Abimelech from her. Then God gives Abimelech a command. He says, return the man's wife, for he's a prophet, so that he'll pray for you and you shall live. But if you don't return her, you will surely die, you and all who are yours. God can overcome our lack of faith. Abraham showed a lack of faith by, rather than just saying, this is my wife, what are you going to do about it? Instead, he said, this is my sister. And so then Abimelech took her as a wife. And things could have gotten really bad, but God still had his plan. God still had his promise. And despite Abraham's failure in his faith, God still stayed true to his promise. And God can overcome our lack of faith. You remember what the man said one time? Jesus told him, all things are possible if you believe. And he said, I believe, help my unbelief. That's the way we are sometimes. Say, Lord, I believe you can do it, but I've got that nagging feeling that you can't do it. So help me to get rid of that nagging feeling that I have. God can overcome our lack of faith. Next, I want you to see the disclosure in verses 8 through 13. Abimelech gets up as soon as it's light, and he starts telling all his servants what happened, and they were afraid. They're afraid because they're like, you had the Lord appear to you in a dream. Oh, this could get really bad. And so Abimelech calls Abraham in, and he gives it to him. I mean, he really does. He says, what have you done to us? And how have I sinned against you, that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done to me things that ought not to be done. What did you see that you did this thing? Why have you done this to me, Abraham? Why have you made it where I almost died? I've got servants that are sick. God has closed up the womb of everyone in my household. Why have you done this to me? And Abraham says, well, I looked and I said, there's no fear of God here. So I was thinking you might kill me. I was worried that you might kill me. And then he even tries to rationalize what he said. Besides, she is indeed my sister. the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. He says, well, she's my half-sister, so I only told you a half-lie. Right? Only told you a half-lie. Now, we think that's weird, right? If you married your half-sister. Yeah. You know, that is weird. Things were a little bit different back then. If you got to know the laws of Moses that came in to say that you couldn't marry your half-sister like that, those weren't in place because the genetics were much more pure back then. And so things were okay to be done like that. But that's what he said. He said, she is my half-sister. Now I'm going to take Abimelech's side here. We have to call out people when they do wrong, and we do it without violence. Abimelech probably wanted to beat Abraham for this. He probably did. He could have just kicked Sarah and Abraham out of his land and told them to never come back. He could have given Sarah back and then said, and Abraham, I'm taking everything you brought into this land. And probably most kings would have tried to kill Abraham. But Abimelech did the right thing. He confronted him and he asked for an explanation. Too often we let sin go unchecked. When sin goes unchecked, then it will continue to fester and grow. And too often we just decide we're going to let it go. We're not going to say anything about it. When somebody wrongs us, the best thing that we can do is to do exactly what Abimelech does. He goes and he talks to Abraham about it. Just like what the Scripture says in Matthew 18. If you have something that's wrong with somebody else, what do? You go to them first about it. And you get it worked out. Too often, we go the other way. We either let it go and we let sin go unchecked and we let it fester and grow, or we go the other way and we overreact and we get angry and violent about it. And that's not the way we should go either. There is a middle ground, and we need to take it. We speak the truth, but we speak truth in love. And that's what we do. Why do we confront sin? Because we love the sinner, and we want them to be right with God. Finally, we'll see the denouement in 14 through 18. I just figured I'd use another French word since we used déjà vu before. Denouement just means the end of the story, the resolution of the story. It's what comes after the climax in literary things. Abimelech gives Abraham sheep and oxen and servants. Then he gives Sarah back, and he says, you could dwell anywhere you want in the land. Then he gives him 1,000 pieces of silver and says, Sarah, I've given him 1,000 pieces of silver so that everybody knows that me and you didn't do anything. And you are innocent. And then Abraham returns the favor like this. He prays. He prays. Abimelech is healed, and all the house of Abimelech was healed, and God, who had closed up their wounds, opened them back up again. A couple points of application here as we close out. We can make friends with those we've disagreed with in the past. We can make friends with them again. Abimelech and Abraham are actually going to end up as pretty good friends. You'll see later on. Now, I hope y'all are all sitting down. Let me check and make sure you are. Because I know this might be a shock. You know I'm a Republican, and you might be interested to know that I have friends that are Democrats. Can you believe that? Right? Doesn't that feel weird in today's day and age? That nobody, unless you believe with me on all, I have 100 political points, and if you don't agree with me on all 100 political points, we can't be friends anymore. Doesn't that seem what it's like now? That's not the way that it has to be. It's not the way that it has to be. It seems like a miracle when somebody from different sides of the political spectrum can sit down and be friends together. We can be friends with those we've disagreed with. Maybe this week, give a phone call to somebody that you have had a disagreement with and you hadn't talked to in a long time, just to get it right. See if it doesn't make you feel better. See if it doesn't take some of that burden off of you. And then number 2, prayer is worth a lot. I think the exchange was equal here. Abimelech gave Abraham sheep, oxen, servants, and 1,000 pieces of silver. And what did Abraham give? Prayer. A powerful prayer of someone in the faith is worth sheep and oxen and servants and 1,000 pieces of silver. Don't discount the value of prayer. Too often people say, is there anything I could do for you? You say, well, you could pray for me. Well, is there anything else? Well, yeah, sometimes we can help with other things. But we can't discount the value of prayer. Because that's how important prayer is. Look at what Abraham's prayer did. It healed his house. With that one prayer, God said, yes, I will listen to it. And yes, I will heal you. Don't discount the value of prayer. When your faith gets overwhelmed by fear, try to stay in your faith. But when you fail in your faith, you have to turn and make it right. We have to speak truth about sin, but speak it in love. We have to make friends out of our enemies. And we can't discount the value of prayer. Let's bow our heads together.